Cliff Richard is a music legend who rose to fame in the late 1950s and became one of the most enduring pop icons in British history. Known for his clean-cut image and timeless hits, Cliff charmed audiences across generations, building a career that spanned decades. From early rock and roll success to becoming a national treasure, he remained a consistent presence in the spotlight, always polished, always composed. But behind the fame and carefully crafted persona, there were parts of Cliff's life he kept hidden from the public eye. Now, after all these years, Cliff Richard is finally ready to speak, and what he reveals has left even his most devoted fans completely stunned. His story didn't begin under the flashing lights of a stage or the hum of a recording studio. It began aboard a ship called the SS Ranchi in 1948, carrying families away from a collapsing British Empire in India to an England still reeling from the aftermath of war. Born Harry Roger Webb in Lucknow in 1940, Cliff entered the world as bombs fell and empires crumbled. His early years were marked by unrest, change, and displacement. At just 8 years old, Harry left India with his parents and siblings, sailing toward a new life that promised little comfort. Post-war England was cold, grey, and unwelcoming. His family settled in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, far from glamorous. There were no concerts, no screaming fans, just overcrowded housing, second-hand clothes, and ration cards. His father, Roger, worked at a catering company while his mother, Dorothy, struggled to keep the family together on what little they had. Harry learned quickly to keep his head down. The transition from India to England was jarring, and he often faced teasing for his accent and appearance. The boy who would later be called the British Elvis spent his early school days feeling like an outsider. Music became his escape, though even then it was a secret. Songs sung quietly to the radio, sometimes locked away in the bathroom. At 16, Harry got his first guitar. It wasn't new, not even close, but it unlocked something inside him that had been buried. He began playing at school events and church gatherings, slowly allowing his voice to rise above the noise of everyday survival. In these small performances, something shifted. His classmates noticed, and for the first time, Harry felt seen. By 1957, he had joined a local band called the Drifters, playing skiffle and early rock and roll in small clubs. It wasn't fame, but it was a start. A year later, a talent manager bluntly told him that Harry Webb wasn't a star's name. If he wanted to be heard, he needed something stronger. Cliff, sharp, unyielding, and Richard borrowed from his idol Little Richard. Just like that, Harry was gone and Cliff Richard was born. The transformation was more than just a name. It was armor. Behind the polished stage persona was still a boy shaped by loss, poverty, and loneliness. But the world would never see that. Cliff built a wall of control and discipline, refusing to let emotions interfere with his work. From his earliest success, he had already learned the habit of hiding parts of himself, a pattern that would follow him throughout life. By the time Move had hit the airwaves in 1958, Cliff had fully stepped into his new role. The song, raw, bold, and undeniably British, wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural reset. It didn't imitate American rock and roll. It announced that Britain had its own voice. That voice belonged to a 17-year-old boy who, only a few years earlier, had been just another immigrant kid in hammer-down shoes. Fame came almost overnight. Teenagers plastered their walls with his picture, and newspapers declared him the answer to Elvis. Amid the mania, Cliff remained reserved. He smiled for the cameras, sang into microphones, shook hands with fans, and gave the world the image it wanted. But behind the scenes, he stayed measured and methodical, knowing fame was fragile and could disappear as quickly as it came. From the start, people sensed a mystery about him. He wasn't the rebellious bad boy rocker, nor the charming flirt. He was harder to read. Cliff knew exactly how to hold the spotlight, but he also knew how to keep it from shining too deeply into the parts of his life he wanted hidden. And that's where his story truly begins. With a boy who carried more than a guitar onto the stage, he carried memories, losses, and unspoken truths. By 1958, Harry Webb was no longer just a boy with a guitar. He was Cliff Richard, standing at the edge of something big. The transformation wasn't just about image, it was about identity. Suddenly, he wasn't playing school halls or church basements. He was on national television, on the radio, and in the tabloids. Girls screamed his name, fainted in crowds, and chased his tour bus. A star had been born, but beneath the music and fame, Cliff Richard remained a man with secret the world was never meant to see. It was a kind of madness the British music scene had never seen before, a full-blown cultural phenomenon the press quickly labeled Cliff Mania. Everywhere he went, chaos followed. Yet as his public image grew larger, Cliff became increasingly cautious behind the scenes. Fame had come fast, too fast, and he instinctively understood how dangerous it could be to lose control of his story. He cultivated a clean image, wore sharp suits, and rarely revealed vulnerability in interviews. Fans knew the smile, the songs, and the charm, but very few ever glimpsed what lay behind the curtain. With his band, now renamed the Shadows, backing him, Cliff dominated the charts with hits like Living Doll, Traveling Light, and Please Don't Tease, often outselling even the American stars. He wasn't just Britain's answer to Elvis. For a time, he was bigger. In 1965, an international fan poll even ranked him above Elvis Presley as the world's most popular male vocalist, and that same year he represented the UK at Eurovision, finishing second with Congratulations, a song that remains one of his most iconic. Yet even in this whirlwind of success, Cliff never seemed fully relaxed. In interviews, he was charming but carefully composed, steering conversations back to music whenever they veered toward his personal life. While contemporaries indulged in rebellion and excess, Cliff projected discipline, avoiding scandal, drinking little, and never appearing in the gossip columns for wild behavior. Those close to him described him as guarded, and while his peers lived loud, Cliff's dressing rooms remained quiet, his pre-show ritual anchored in prayer. Rumors about his personal life surfaced occasionally, but he always responded with polite distance. He had learned early that fame was fragile, and so he built his career by keeping parts of himself off limits, not out of shame, but because some things were too personal, too delicate, too sacred to share. On stage, he could be someone else, confident, clean-cut, untouchable. And it worked. By the early 1960s, Cliff was more than a chart-topping singer. He had become the very face of British pop. With hits like The Young Ones, Bachelor Boy, and Summer Holiday, he not only topped the charts but also shaped the sound of a generation. His films and global tours carried the same family-friendly energy that made him a household name, setting him apart from the wilder rockers of the era. His image wasn't an act. Cliff truly was disciplined and thoughtful, but the very qualities that made him admired also made him increasingly isolated. He had mastered how to be loved, but not how to be truly known. Questions about marriage and relationships were always deflected with a smile or a joke, leaving fans to speculate endlessly. Then, in 1966, Cliff made a decision that stunned the industry. At a Christian outreach event with American evangelist Billy Graham, he stood before a crowd and declared his faith. "I'm not just in show business because I want to become famous and make a lot of money. I do it now because I can give that service to God, and I can do things like this because my name happens to be Cliff Richard." It wasn't a stunt or a rehearsed line. It was Cliff speaking from the heart. And in that moment, he became the first British pop star to take such a bold public stand on religion, a choice that would forever shape his life and career. For many fans and music executives, it was unexpected, even alarming. Rumors spread that Cliff was about to give up music and devote his life to the church, and record executives panicked, fearing his best years were already behind him. But Cliff didn't quit. Instead, he quietly made some changes, stepping back from the spotlight, re-evaluating his priorities, and returning not as someone different but as someone clearer. He began choosing songs with deeper meaning, singing with more control and less flash, no longer chasing hits the way others did, because now he had something else anchoring him. For Cliff, faith wasn't a detail, it was a foundation. This shift didn't cost him his audience. If anything, it earned him more respect, but it also deepened the mystery around him. He was still the smiling, energetic icon, yet now he was also someone who held firm beliefs, valued privacy, and refused to be everything to everyone. That made him harder to reach, even for those closest to him. Over the years, journalists circled the question of why Cliff never married. In an industry known for whirlwind romances, dramatic breakups, and scandalous headlines, Cliff remained untouched by it all. He spoke often about love in songs and interviews, but never about anyone in particular. Curiosity turned into confusion, but what no one knew at the time was that his heart had once been set on someone always just slightly out of reach, a story he kept buried away from tabloids fans, and even friends who might have understood. Through the 1970s and 1980s, his music evolved again, with hits like Devil Woman and We Don't Talk Anymore proving he could adapt to new sounds while staying true to his values. Critics and fellow artists admired his longevity. Eric Clapton remarked he never got enough credit. Jimmy Page praised his work ethic, and younger stars saw him as a figure of quiet resilience. Yet behind the polished image, Cliff carried a hidden love. He never explained publicly why he never married, brushing off questions with polite humor. But at the heart of his silence was a name most people knew but few suspected: Olivia Newton-John. Cliff first met her in the early 1970s, when her own star was rising, and the two shared not just a stage but an unmistakable chemistry. Their friendship was warm, genuine, and supportive, but for Cliff, it became something more, a slow, certain kind of love that lingered quietly over time. He never confessed it, partly because Olivia had been engaged to Bruce Welch, Cliff's longtime friend and guitarist in the Shadows, and even after that ended, she later married someone else. Cliff would never interfere. Instead, he carried the feelings silently, year after year, even as their lives and careers intertwined. They performed together, attended events side by side, and always spoke warmly of each other, though publicly their bond was framed as friendship. Still, anyone who saw them on stage sensed there was something deeper in the ease, tenderness, and unspoken understanding between them. Cliff remained unmarried. Olivia built her own life, but their connection endured. When Cliff turned 75 in 2015, Olivia joined him for a duet at his birthday concert, their voices blending effortlessly, their eyes filled with emotion. Neither said a word about what it meant. Then, in 2022, came the news Cliff had dreaded but never truly prepared for. Olivia passed away after a long battle with breast cancer. She died peacefully, surrounded by loved ones, and Cliff, heartbreakingly, was among the last to see her. In the quiet grief that followed, he described her passing not as a loss, but as a simply stopping living. For those who had been paying attention, it was finally clear that Olivia had always meant more to him than he had ever dared admit. When he spoke about her, the carefully composed Cliff Richard cracked just a little. The emotion in his voice didn't need explanation. And finally, years after her passing, Cliff began to open up about it. He didn't frame it as regret, and he didn't blame timing or circumstance, but he admitted that he had loved her, that the affection he had carried for her had stayed with him through decades of performances, interviews, and lonely hotel rooms. He confessed that he had never married because, in some quiet part of himself, he had already found the person who held his heart. He said it without bitterness. There was no resentment, no what-if fantasy, just a quiet acknowledgement of something real that had never been spoken. And that silence, it turns out, had shaped much of his life. He had poured that unspoken love into music, into faith, into discipline. It wasn't just Olivia's absence that shaped him. It was the presence of a love that had nowhere to go. But even more recently, Cliff revealed something shocking. The moment that shattered his silence came in 2014, when a storm unlike anything before shook his world. It was public, relentless, and unforgiving. That summer, Cliff's home was raided live on camera. The event was broadcast by the BBC in partnership with South Yorkshire Police, who had launched an investigation based on a single allegation from a man claiming an incident decades earlier at a 1985 Billy Graham event. The accusation was serious, but from the start it lacked evidence. Still, the police and the BBC struck a secret deal for exclusive access to the raid, capturing every moment in what the BBC called their money shot. The world watched as police officers searched Cliff's home, a scene broadcast repeatedly on television and online. The humiliation was brutal for a man who had spent his entire career carefully protecting his privacy. No charges were ever filed. The claim was eventually debunked as false and illogical, but the damage had already been done. Headlines screamed. Fans and strangers alike were forced to grapple with questions no one wanted to ask. Cliff himself was left shattered. Behind closed doors, the toll was severe. He developed shingles, a painful viral condition triggered by stress. Depression took hold. He lost weight and struggled with insomnia. For months, he couldn't function properly. The man who had always been seen as composed, disciplined, and strong was breaking. The investigation dragged on for nearly 2 years, cost him more than $800,000 of public funds. Despite the lack of evidence, the accuser continued to be treated as credible. Worse still, a man later tried to blackmail Cliff, exploiting the public drama for his own gain. In 2018, Cliff fought back legally. He won a landmark privacy case against the BBC, which the court condemned for sensationalist and irresponsible behavior. The ruling led to changes in UK media law, tightening rules on how police investigations could be reported. But the victory came too late to undo the damage. Now, years later, Cliff finally opened up about what he had kept hidden all those years, the deep emotional scars left by the false allegations and the relentless media coverage. He spoke of nights spent staring at the ceiling, struggling to breathe, to sleep, to find peace, of feeling trapped, misunderstood, and alone. And perhaps most shocking of all, Cliff revealed that for a long time after the raid, he seriously considered walking away from music altogether. The career he had dedicated his life to, the passion that had fueled him from the beginning, suddenly felt like a burden too heavy to carry. But he didn't quit. Instead, he leaned on his faith, the same faith he had embraced decades earlier. It gave him the strength to face the darkest days. It reminded him who he was beyond headlines and rumors, and it helped him find a way back to the stage, to the fans, to the music. Rebuilding, reflection, and the road ahead, these became the defining themes of Cliff Richard's life after the fallout from the 2014 raid, which lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. For Cliff, life was no longer just about singing or performing. It became about reclaiming his identity and healing wounds the public couldn't see but that he felt deeply. His legal victory against the BBC in 2018 was a landmark moment, with the court condemning the broadcaster's sensationalist tactics and confirming that Cliff's privacy had been violated. This case forced changes in UK media law, making it harder for police and the press to broadcast suspects' identities before charges are proven. Yet despite this win, Cliff admitted the damage was permanent, not just to his reputation, but to his spirit. Fans who had quietly stood by him for years became more vocal in their support after the truth came out, flooding social media with messages reminding the world that Cliff was more than headlines, but a man whose music had shaped lives for generations. Many expressed regret over the public trial by media he endured, and praised his courage for finally speaking openly about his experience. Cliff himself adopted a new outlook, acknowledging that his ordeal had forced him to slow down and reflect on what truly mattered. The relentless pace of the music industry and the pressure to maintain a perfect image gave way to a quieter life focused on healing and faith. Remaining unmarried, he continues to live modestly, choosing peace over publicity. His concerts, though fewer, still attract loyal fans who now appreciate the honesty and warmth he brings to the stage. He no longer sings for fame or charts, but because music is part of who he is, a way to connect, to express, and to find solace. Looking back, Cliff says he regrets nothing about his life's journey, the successes, the heartbreak, even the hardships. Each chapter shaped him. But now, for the first time, he welcomes being fully seen, not as a perfect icon, but as a real person with scars, stories, and emotions. He has begun to share more openly about his past, including the decades-long love he quietly carried for Olivia Newton-John, the pain of losing her, and the deep wounds left by the false allegations. This vulnerability is something fans had never seen before, and it has brought them closer than ever. Cliff's story is a reminder that fame can hide more than it reveals, and that sometimes the hardest battles are fought in silence. Now that the silence has been broken, he is finally free to be himself, not just the star millions adore, but the man who has lived a life of love, loss, faith, and resilience. Would you have kept the secrets if you were in Cliff's shoes? Let us know in the comments.